I've spent most of my life in the wilderness, but I'd be lying if I said the forest never got to me. There's something about being alone in the woods at night, something that makes you second-guess every shadow, every sound. I've always prided myself on being a rational man. 38 years in this world, 15 of them spent guiding people through some of the most rugged backcountry in Colorado. But that night, the night I saw the lantern, all the logic in the world couldn't explain what I witnessed. It was late September, the kind of crisp, quiet night where the cold creeps into your bones the second you stop moving. I was doing my usual patrol in Rocky Ridge National Forest, walking a section of trail that cut near Pine Hollow, an area long marked as off-limits after dark. Too many accidents, too many hikers wandering too close to the ravine that dropped off into nothing but jagged rocks and forgotten bones. My job wasn't complicated. Make sure no one was camping out there, clear out any rule breakers, and move on. But that night, there were no campers, just the light. At first I thought it was a campfire. I saw a faint glow flickering through the trees, low to the ground, off-trail. Campfires were strictly prohibited this time of year, the dry season turning the woods into a tinderbox. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and started toward it, already preparing my usual speech about safety and park regulations. But as I got closer, something felt off. The glow wasn't steady, wasn't the warm orange flicker of a fire. It shimmered, pale, almost silver, moving like it was swaying in the wind. And the forest, normally alive with the sounds of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl, was silent. Not just quiet, dead silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just the rhythmic crunch of my boots against the dirt as I moved forward. The closer I got, the stranger it became. The light drifted between the trees, always just out of reach, as if it was leading me somewhere. I told myself it had to be a person, maybe another ranger with an old-school lantern. But who the hell used lanterns anymore? And why weren't they answering me? "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Park Service, you're in a restricted area. You need to head back to the main trail." No response. I took another step forward, and just like that, the light stopped moving. It hovered, steady now, nestled between two towering pines. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed, "Don't go any closer," but my duty as a ranger, my rational mind, told me I had to investigate. If someone was out here, they could be in trouble, maybe lost, maybe injured. I pressed on. As I stepped into the clearing, the light flickered once, twice, and then vanished. I swung my flashlight in its direction, the beam cutting through the darkness, and that's when I saw it. The lantern. It was hanging from a low tree branch, swaying slightly, even though there wasn't so much as a whisper of wind. The glass was thick with grime, the metal frame rusted and corroded like it had been sitting there for decades. But there was no sign of the person who had been carrying it. I swallowed hard, scanning the ground around me. No footprints, no trampled leaves, nothing to suggest anyone had even been there. My skin prickled. I told myself to turn back, that this wasn't my problem, that I'd report it in the morning and let someone else deal with it. But I couldn't just leave the lantern there, still burning. I stepped closer, reaching out with tentative fingers. The metal was ice cold, far too cold for something that had just been lit. I hesitated, then twisted the knob, snuffing out the flame. The second the light went out, the forest changed. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. The silence deepened, thick and suffocating. I took a step back, my own breath sounding unnaturally loud in my ears. The lantern still hung there, dead and dark, yet I felt like I was being watched. Something shifted in the trees behind me. I whipped around, flashlight beam darting between the trunks. Nothing. I took a shaky breath. "Get a grip, James." I forced myself to move, to back away from the clearing, my boots crunching against the forest floor. I told myself it was fine. It was just an old lantern, probably left behind by some hiker years ago. Nothing more. But then, as I reached the edge of the clearing, my flashlight flickered. For a split second, just before the beam cut out completely, I saw something standing between the trees. Not a person, not an animal, just a shape, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that reflected nothing. And then Darkness. My flashlight died in my hands. I staggered back, fumbling with the switch, my fingers clumsy with panic. The beam finally sputtered back to life, casting jagged shadows across the clearing. The figure was gone. I didn't think. I just ran. I tore back toward the main trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. I didn't stop, didn't look back, not until I saw the dim glow of my ranger station in the distance. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it without hesitation. For the rest of the night, I sat in my chair, flashlight clutched in my hand, waiting for dawn. Every so often, I glanced out the window, expecting to see that faint flicker of light in the woods. But it never came. The next day, I went back. I told myself it was all in my head, that the stress, the isolation, had made me see things that weren't there. I retraced my steps, back to the clearing. The lantern was gone. There were no signs of a fire, no burned-out wick, no rusted handle swaying from the tree. Just undisturbed forest, as if nothing had ever been there. I don't talk about that night, not to my fellow rangers, not to my friends. I keep it buried, a memory that feels like a warning. Because sometimes, when I'm patrolling late at night, when the wind dies down and the forest goes silent, I see it again, a flicker, just a glimpse, like something is still waiting for me to follow. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I believe in something. I spent the last 20 years working as a paramedic, pulling people from wrecked cars, reviving overdose victims, and tending to burns so bad the flesh peeled away like wax. I've seen death in ways most people never will. But nothing, not a single one of those nights spent battling time to keep someone alive, prepared me for what I saw on Blue Lake Trail. I had been hiking alone for years, ever since I retired at 46. Something about the solitude of the trail, the rhythm of my boots on dirt, helped clear my mind in a way that nothing else could. That morning, I had set out before dawn, hoping to get a quiet, foggy sunrise over Cedar Pass. I should have known better. The fog was thicker than I expected, a heavy, rolling mist that swallowed everything around me. It muffled the sounds of the forest, dulling the usual morning symphony of birds and rustling leaves into something unnatural. I had walked Blue Lake Trail dozens of times, but that morning it felt different. The trees pressed in closer, the air thick and still. My breathing sounded too loud. Then, about a mile in, I saw it, a figure. It stood about 40 yards ahead, motionless in the center of the trail. At first, I assumed it was another hiker, maybe someone taking in the quiet like I was. But something about the way they stood was off. I slowed my steps. The fog curled around them, shifting like slow-moving water. I could barely make out details, just a tall, thin silhouette, its head tilted slightly, as if watching me. "Morning!" I called out, forcing an easy tone, hoping for a response. Nothing. They didn't move, didn't shift their weight, didn't flinch, didn't even breathe, as far as I could tell. I took another cautious step forward, squinting through the mist. The figure was still too far away to make out a face, but I could see the way the fog clung to them, almost as if it was rolling off their skin. "Hey!" I tried again, louder this time. "You lost?" No answer. A cold sensation crawled up my spine. The hairs on my arms stood up, the kind of instinctive reaction I used to get when a call was about to go south, when I just knew a patient was going to crash, even before the monitors told me so. Then, before I could take another step forward, the figure disappeared. Not like someone walking away, not like someone ducking into the woods. 1 second, they were there, and the next they weren't. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse hammering. The fog rolled lazily over the empty path ahead, shifting with the wind. I swept my gaze across the trees, searching for movement. Nothing. For a long moment, I just stood there, listening. The silence had settled over the trail like a thick, heavy blanket. No birds, no wind, nothing but the damp air pressing in around me. Then I heard it. A scream, high-pitched, ragged, piercing. It sliced through the fog like a knife, too close, too clear. My body reacted before my brain did. I took off running, following the sound, heart hammering in my chest. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by that awful silence again. I skidded to a stop, chest heaving, and then The footsteps. Soft at first, light crunches in the leaves behind me. I turned sharply, eyes darting through the fog. Nothing. Then another crunch. To my left this time. I whipped around again, heart pounding. The steps weren't random. They were circling me. I swallowed hard. "Who's there?" No answer. The fog swirled, thickening like something alive. I took a slow step back, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't like this. This wasn't normal. Then, just ahead, the figure returned, standing in the exact same spot as before. Closer this time. I could see it better now. Tall, unnaturally thin, dressed in something that looked like tattered old clothing. Its head was still tilted, but there was something wrong with its face. I couldn't see it, even up close. Even in the shifting fog, there was nothing where its face should have been, just empty, pale skin. I stumbled back, instinct screaming at me to run, but my body refused to move. Then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished again. That was it. I ran. I don't know how far I went. I don't remember half the trail. My legs just moved, burning, pushing me forward, heart pounding like a drum beat in my ears. I didn't stop until I saw the break in the trees, the thin sliver of daylight breaking through at the trailhead. I made it to my car in seconds, fumbling with my keys, shaking so hard I nearly dropped them. When I finally managed to unlock the door, I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder, and there at the tree line it stood, no more than 20 yards away, watching, waiting. For a split second, I swear I saw its head tilt a fraction more, like it knew I saw it, like it was acknowledging me. I didn't stick around to see what it did next. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and peeled out of the lot so fast my tires kicked up gravel. I didn't look back, not until I was miles down the road, far from the trail, my heart finally slowing. Only then did I let myself breathe, hands height-knuckling the wheel. And yet even now, even as I sit here writing this, I can still see it in my mind. That tall, thin figure, standing in the mist, waiting at the edge of the woods. I haven't been back to Blue Lake Trail since. I won't go back. But sometimes, on foggy mornings, when I step outside my house and see the mist rolling in over the hills, I get this feeling, like something is still watching me, like something is waiting, and if I ever step too close to the trees again, if I ever let the fog swallow me whole, I won't be coming back. I don't know what's worse, seeing something you can't explain, or hearing something you know was never supposed to be there. I've always considered myself a logical person. I teach science, after all. Observation, evidence, explanation, that's how I process the world. But logic didn't help me on that trail. It didn't help me when I heard those whispers. After what happened to me, I don't go hiking alone anymore. I was in Redwood Hills, California, on a solo summer backpacking trip, a much-needed escape before the chaos of the school year started again. Being a teacher means you live your life in cycles, 9 months of stress, 3 months of reprieve. I had spent weeks planning my route, mapping out campsites, and stocking up on enough gear to last me 5 days. It was supposed to be a reset, just me, nature, and time to breathe. I made good progress the first 2 days, covering miles without issue. The third day, though, that's when everything changed. It started with the side trail. It wasn't marked, just a narrow break in the trees off to my left. I wouldn't have even noticed it if I hadn't stopped to adjust my pack. The path was overgrown, winding into the forest like a forgotten road. I told myself it was probably a game trail, maybe an old logging route. But there was something about it, something that made me curious. That was my first mistake. I should have stayed on the main path. I stepped off the marked trail and onto the narrow one, pushing aside the thick branches as I moved forward. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birds, insects, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, gone. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it, but then the whispers started, soft, just at the edge of hearing. I stopped, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound wasn't the wind, it wasn't animals, it was voices. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. No one was there. I swallowed hard. Maybe it was another hiker, someone ahead of me, just out of sight. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too small in the vastness of the trees. The whispering stopped. Silence. And then, a single word, spoken so softly I almost didn't hear it. Keep going. My stomach dropped. It wasn't my imagination. Something had spoken. I turned back toward the main trail, forcing myself to move faster, but somehow the way back was gone. The trail had disappeared. I spun in place, my pulse hammering. There was no path behind me anymore, only dense trees and tangled underbrush. I was trapped. I pulled out my phone, fingers shaking, but the screen showed no service. The GPS was frozen, refusing to load. I wasn't panicking yet. Not yet. I told myself to retrace my steps, find landmarks, stay calm. But the whispers started again. This time, they were all around me. Somewhere, just beyond the trees, they were speaking. Not words I could understand, just a low, murmuring chorus, like a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. And then, above the whispering, something laughed. A dry, brittle chuckle. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. My feet pounded against the earth, branches clawing at my arms, my legs. I ran until my lungs burned, until my vision blurred from the effort. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, the forest had changed. The trees were different now, taller, older, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The sky above had darkened, though it couldn't have been more than mid-sector noon. I had no idea where I was. I listened, my breath ragged. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard it again. That laugh. Closer this time. I turned, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. And that's when I saw it. Not a person, not an animal. A shape, standing deep in the trees, just at the edge of my vision, too far to see clearly, too close to ignore. It was watching me. I took a step back. It moved. Not toward me. Not yet. It simply shifted, like it was adjusting its stance, like it was waiting for something. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran for. The forest was a maze, twisting in on itself, leading me in circles. The whispers followed me. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, they would start again, soft, insistent, urging me to keep going. I don't know how, but eventually I stumbled back onto the main trail. 1 second I was surrounded by ancient gnarled trees. The next I was standing in familiar territory. Just like that, the forest was normal again. The birds were chirping, the air was lighter, the whispers had stopped. I collapsed to my knees, sucking in ragged breaths, my body trembling. I looked back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shape standing at the tree line. But there was nothing there. The side trail, the one I had taken, was gone. Just dense forest, no break in the trees, no sign it had ever been there. I sat there for a long time, too scared to move, too exhausted to think. When I finally found the strength to stand, I forced myself to keep walking. I didn't look back. I made it back to my campsite before dark, packed my things, and left first thing in the morning. I never went back, and I never told anyone. Not really. Because how do you explain that? How do you tell someone you got lost on a trail that didn't exist? How do you explain whispers in the trees, calling you deeper into the woods? You don't. You keep your mouth shut, and you never, ever leave the marked trail again. If there's one thing I've learned from my years working in the ER, it's that people tend to ignore their instincts until it's too late. You hear stories of patients who had a feeling something was wrong, but didn't go to the doctor until it was nearly too late. People who knew they shouldn't have been in a certain place, shouldn't have taken that shortcut, but did anyway. I used to think those stories were just bad luck, but now I know better. I should have trusted my instincts that day in Blackwood Preserve. I should have turned around the first time I saw it, but I didn't. It was early September, and I had 3 days off from my shifts at the hospital. I needed the break. Between the endless codes, the back-to-back trauma cases, and the hours spent under flickering fluorescent lights, I was suffocating. I just wanted silence, time away from people, from the beeping monitors, from the smell of antiseptic that seemed to cling to my skin no matter how many times I showered. I picked Blackwood Preserve because it was quiet, secluded, I'd hiked the main trail once before with a friend, but this time I wanted to be alone. Just me and nature, nothing else. The first few miles were perfect. Sunlight filtered through the trees, the crisp mountain air filled my lungs, and for the first time in weeks, my body felt light. The tension that had built up in my shoulders and back started to melt away. Then I saw it. It stood maybe 30 yards ahead, just off the side of the trail. A person. No, not a person. Something else. It was tall, impossibly thin, standing perfectly still between the trees. The moment I laid eyes on it, my stomach tightened into a knot. The first thing that hit me was the unnatural stillness. Most people shift their weight, breathe heavily after a hike, fidget with their gear, but this thing, it just stood there, facing me, like it had been waiting. I couldn't make out its face. The shadows played tricks with the light, making its features indistinct. I thought maybe it was just another hiker, standing weirdly still, but the longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed. I told myself to keep walking. That's what normal people do, right? Just keep moving, don't make it weird. So, I did. As I passed, I stole another glance. It was still watching me. The air felt colder suddenly, like stepping into an air-conditioned room on a sweltering day. My legs wanted to move faster. My instincts were screaming, telling me to leave, but I forced myself to stay calm. I walked on, never looking back. A half-mile later, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The forest seemed normal again. The tension eased a little. I convinced myself it was nothing, just some guy standing weirdly still, maybe lost in thought. But then I saw it again, farther up the trail, closer this time, standing just ahead of me, on the path, like it had somehow moved without me seeing it. My heart slammed against my ribs. There was no way, no way. I stopped in my tracks, my breathing shallow. I could see it better now. The pale, almost colorless skin, the way it stood just slightly off balance, like a marionette with its strings cut, and its head was tilted just a fraction too far to the side, like it was studying me. I wanted to turn around, wanted to go back the way I came, but something told me if I turned my back on it, if I looked away for too long, it would be closer the next time I looked. I clenched my fists, forced my legs to move, and walked forward. As I passed, it did something I will never forget. It turned its head to follow me. The movement was too smooth, too fluid, like a slide, not a turn. That was it. I started running. Not a jog, not a fast walk. I ran like my life depended on it. My lungs burned, my pulse roared in my ears, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare. I ran until my legs screamed, until I could see the parking lot ahead. My car, salvation. Then, from the corner of my eye, movement. I didn't want to look, but I did. They said, and I saw it, standing at the tree line, half hidden by the branches, watching. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped them. As I threw open the door, I made one last mistake. I looked back. It was closer, stepping out of the trees, moving toward me. I slammed the door, started the engine, and peeled out of the parking lot so fast I nearly hit a tree. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I couldn't, not until I was miles away, the safety of the highway stretching ahead of me. Only then did my hands stop shaking. Only then did I let myself breathe. I haven't been back to Blackwood Preserve since. I don't plan to, but sometimes, on long shifts, when I'm staring into the sterile white lights of the ER, I think about it. That unnatural stillness, that colorless skin, that tilted head, watching me with something that was not curiosity. I should have trusted my instincts, because now I know it wasn't just watching, it was waiting. I should have known. I should have turned around when the trees started to change, when the forest grew quieter, and when the trail beneath my feet felt more like a memory than a path. But I didn't. I kept walking, thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could escape everything back home. The chaos, the people, the loud silence of my life. It was only after I'd seen the cabin that I truly understood I was never meant to find it. But that was later. I'm a photographer, a wildlife photographer, and the trip I planned to Echo Valley, West Virginia, was supposed to be simple. Just a week in the wilderness, away from the chaos of city life. I'd been to places more isolated than this, but Echo Valley was different. It felt alive, in a way that most forests don't. The air tasted thick with history, and the trees seemed to have their own pulse, like they were listening, waiting, watching. I arrived at the trailhead early, around sunrise. The mist hovered low, rolling like fog, draped over the forest floor. The kind of mist that seemed almost deliberate, as if it didn't want to let go of the night just yet. I loved it. The quiet of morning, the smell of damp earth and pine, it all made me feel like I could breathe again. I trekked through the main trail, snapping pictures of the natural world, until the forest started to feel strange. It wasn't the mist. It wasn't the weather either. It was the feeling that something was watching me. Not just the usual animals, but something else. The trees grew denser, the trail narrower. The forest seemed to close in around me, the path almost disappearing beneath my feet. I found myself walking slower, almost hesitant, even though I had no reason to be. Then, I saw it. A cabin. It was hidden in a clearing, tucked between two thick clusters of trees. I couldn't believe it at first. No signs, no markers, no trail maps. Just this weathered cabin standing like a relic from another time. I approached slowly, my curiosity pulling me forward despite a sudden feeling of unease. The cabin looked abandoned, its wooden walls warped from age and weather, its windows dark, but a light flickered inside. I froze. No one should have been there. The area was untouched, isolated, so why was there a light? A candle? I pushed the door open without thinking. The hinges creaked loudly, almost protesting the intrusion. Inside, the air felt strangely warm compared to the chill outside. There were dust-covered old chairs, tables, and a candle burning on the windowsill. The scent of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic, almost like rust, lingered in the air. The dust on the furniture seemed fresh, as though someone had just moved through. I stepped in further, cautious but drawn by the strange aura around the place. I felt like an intruder, but also like I was being invited in, almost as if the cabin itself was beckoning me. I took a few steps toward the candle, but something made me stop. There were boot prints, my own boot prints, leading into the cabin. But there were no boot prints leading out. I felt my stomach twist. How could that be? I hadn't seen any tracks outside. There was no snow, no rain, nothing that could have made a mark on the ground. Just dirt. My tracks. Yet here they were, leading inside. But not a single trace leading back out. I turned to leave, my mind spinning, but my heart beat faster as I glanced around one last time. I hadn't noticed before, but the furniture seemed too neat, too perfectly arranged for a place this old. The table was set with dusty plates. The beds were made. It was as if someone had just finished their meal, just got out of bed, and then left without a trace. I hurried for the door, but as I reached for the handle, the light flickered and went out. The cabin was suddenly plunged into darkness. My breath caught in my chest, and I spun around, disoriented. The light, it had just been there. Why would it go out so suddenly? I rushed to the door, wrenching it open, but when I stepped back outside, I stopped dead. The cabin was gone. I stood there, frozen, staring at the place where it had been. The clearing, once home to the dilapidated cabin, was now an empty patch of dirt. No cabin, no light. Just trees, shadows. It had vanished. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. This couldn't be happening. I must have imagined it. Maybe the stress was getting to me, I told myself. But the footprints inside the cabin were still there. I stumbled back, my camera bag bouncing against my side as I fumbled for the camera. I took pictures of the spot where the cabin had been, but when I checked the screen, there was nothing, not a single shot. The cabin didn't appear on film. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. There was no one around. I was completely alone. I started walking, desperate to get back to the main trail. I didn't look back at the spot where the cabin had been. I couldn't. I kept my eyes straight ahead, my breath shallow, my hands shaking. It wasn't until I was nearly out of the forest that I dared to glance over my shoulder. The trees were empty. There was nothing there. but I still couldn't shake the feeling, the sensation, that I had been there, that I had walked inside, touched the furniture, felt the warmth of the candle on my face. It was all so real. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead. I didn't want to leave, but at the same time, I didn't know how much longer I could stay in the forest. The air had changed, the world felt different, and I knew in the deepest part of me, that cabin wasn't supposed to exist, not in this world. The rest of the day passed in a blur. When I finally reached my hotel that night, I checked my camera again. There were still no pictures of the cabin, just a black screen. I don't know if I'll ever go back to Echo Valley, but every time I close my eyes, I still see the cabin. The way it looked when I walked inside, how it felt like it was waiting for me. And every time I hear a creaking sound, I wonder if it's the cabin calling me back. Maybe it's already out there, in the trees, waiting for me to return. It's strange, the way nature can make you feel like you're a part of something much larger than yourself. Like you're a guest in a world that doesn't care whether you stay or go. When I first started kayaking on Moonshadow River, I felt like I was connecting with something ancient, something bigger than the quiet life I'd carved out for myself. But there's a dark side to nature, a side that doesn't care about your plans, your safety, or your understanding of the world. I should have listened when the river whispered my name, but I didn't. I had been planning this solo kayaking trip for months. Moonshadow River is one of those places that only the most adventurous or the most foolish visit. Tucked away in Tennessee, it weaves through dense woods, craggy rocks, and shadows that never quite disappear. The locals, I was told, avoid it. They speak in hushed tones about the river, the way it moves strangely, almost like it's alive. I'd read the warnings, but I didn't believe in ghost stories, not really. I rented a kayak, grabbed my gear, and started off early one morning, the sun still low, casting long shadows across the water. Everything felt perfect. I was alone, the only sound the gentle dip of my paddle, the occasional rustling of a bird. For a while the river was just a path, smooth, winding, peaceful. But then something changed. I heard it. At first it was just a soft splash, distant, like a fish jumping. I ignored it, just the river moving like it always did. But then, as I paddled deeper into the forested cove, the splashing grew louder, closer. I stopped, letting the kayak drift. The splashing stopped too. Silence, but not the peaceful kind, the kind that makes your chest tighten. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably some animal, maybe a beaver or an otter. But then, the whispering started. It was barely audible, just a murmur, but it felt like it was coming from beneath the water. A voice, or maybe 100 voices. At first I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them calling. Something was out there, something waiting. I paddled faster, not because I was scared. No, I told myself. I was just being cautious, keeping my distance. But the splashing continued, relentless. Each stroke of my paddle seemed to pull me deeper into the river's grip. It wasn't like I had any choice, really. The current was gentle, the banks were thick with trees, and there was nowhere to go but forward. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was a rock, or maybe a fallen log, but as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't either of those things. It was a figure, a pale, human-like figure crouched on a rock in the middle of the river. It was watching me. Its eyes, empty, sunken, stared at me with a hunger I couldn't explain. Its skin was as white as the mist that hung over the water, its shape almost shifting, like it wasn't entirely solid. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't move, didn't blink. It just watched. I should have turned around. I should have turned back right then, paddled as fast as I could, and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I slowly raised my paddle, trying to back away, thinking if I moved quietly enough, it wouldn't notice me. But as I did, I felt something brush against the side of my kayak. Cold, wet. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, my eyes wide, but there was nothing. Just the still water, the trees, the silence. But that feeling, the feeling that something was in the water with me, beneath me, lingered. I tried to paddle faster, desperate to get out of that cove, but the splashing grew louder, closer. The water seemed to churn beneath me. And then the voice. This time I could hear it clearly, a low, croaking whisper. Come closer. I wasn't sure if I heard it with my ears or if it was inside my head, but it didn't matter. My body was already reacting, moving faster than my mind could catch up. I paddled harder, pulling myself through the water with everything I had, but as I moved, the water seemed to fight me, tugging at my kayak as though it were trying to pull me back. The whispers got louder, more urgent. Come closer. I glanced over my shoulder, only for a moment, and that's when I saw it. The figure. It was moving, not standing still anymore, not crouching. It was gliding across the water toward me. I didn't even think. I didn't question it. I paddled like I'd never paddled before, my arms burning with the effort, the river fighting me every step of the way. The figure, if you could even call it that, was getting closer. Its legs moved beneath the water, but it didn't seem to be swimming. It was as if it was being carried by something else, something beneath the surface. I felt a rush of cold, and for a moment I was sure the water was going to swallow me whole. The current, the figure, the feeling of being pulled down into the depths. Everything became too much, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figure, the splashing, the whispers, everything vanished. I was alone. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my hands shaking as I gripped the paddle. I turned around, scanning the river, the banks, the trees. Nothing. The water was still again. The mist had lifted. There was no sign of what I'd seen. It felt like a dream. No, a nightmare. I couldn't shake the feeling though, that feeling that something was still watching me, just out of sight. I didn't stop paddling until I reached the end of the river. By then, the sun was low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the water. I finally pulled the kayak ashore, my legs shaky beneath me. I wasn't sure how I managed to make it, but I was out. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. That night, as I lay in my tent, the sound of the river outside felt like a whisper in my ear. I tried to sleep, tried to forget, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, the splashing, the whispering, the thing in the water, waiting for me to come back. I never returned to Moonshadow River, but sometimes, when the night is too quiet and the water is too still, I still hear that splashing. And I wonder, deep down, if it's still waiting for me. I've taken you through 6 unsettling journeys. Stories of lanterns flickering in the dark, figures emerging from the fog, whispers beckoning us deeper into uncharted woods, eerie strangers standing motionless on forest trails, cabins that appear and vanish in the blink of an eye, and something nameless lurking beneath the surface of a quiet river. Each of these tales, while haunting in its own unique way, shares a common thread. In the untamed corners of nature, our senses are often our strongest allies, and ignoring them can come at a steep price. When James first saw that old lantern swaying deep in the Colorado pines, every rational part of him said to turn back, but his duty pushed him forward. Olivia, hiking in Oregon's thick mist, sensed something watching her long before she saw that tall figure on the trail. Noah followed whispered voices that seemed determined to lead him into a place no map could find. Erica tried to shake off the feeling of a stare drilling into her back, but the pale stranger in the woods only confirmed what she already feared. Ben ventured into the West Virginian wilderness and stumbled upon a cabin that shouldn't exist at all, leaving him doubting his own senses. And finally, Lena came face to face with something beneath the water's surface, something that reminded her how easily nature can shift from serene to sinister. These stories teach us one crucial lesson: trust your instincts. The outdoors can be stunning and restorative, but it's also a realm where human rules don't always apply. When a hush falls over the forest and the hairs on your arms stand on end, that sensation isn't mere imagination. It's your body warning you of potential danger, whether it's a sudden silence, a flicker of movement out of the corner of your eye, or a path you know you shouldn't follow. Heed those signals. The characters in these stories paid a price for doubting themselves, and some learned the hard way that the wilderness doesn't offer second chances. I encourage all of you, explore, but do so with respect and caution. Prepare thoroughly, stay on marked paths when you can, and if something feels off, don't be afraid to turn back. The thrill of discovery should never overshadow your well-being. After all, some trails were never meant for us to walk. Finally, I want to say thank you. Your engagement, your comments, and your willingness to journey with me into these dark corners of the natural world have been both humbling and inspiring. It's your curiosity and support that make it possible for me to share these stories. I hope they've sparked your imagination and reminded you that even in our modern age, there are still places that defy easy explanation, and sometimes that mystery is exactly what makes them so compelling. Until next time, stay safe, follow your instincts, and remember that the line between the familiar and the unknown can be frighteningly thin. And if you ever find yourself alone on a silent trail with no clear way back, think of these tales and know you're not truly alone. The wilderness is watching. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.